Welcome back to our channel, The Thinking Cosmos. Today we tackle one of the oldest and most profound questions in philosophy and theology. If God made everything, then who created God? To explore this, we're bringing two brilliant thinkers into a structured, respectful debate. First, we have Ion, a rational theist and philosopher of religion. And joining us is Rafe, an atheist, influenced heavily by the arguments of Richard Dawkins, especially from his book, The God Delusion. Let's get into it. Rafe, thanks for having me. So let me begin simply. If you claim that God created the universe, then you must also ask, where did God come from? If everything needs a cause, then God also needs a cause. If you make God the exception, you've broken your own rule. That's why the question, who created God, is important. It challenges the very foundation of the theistic explanation. Ion, I appreciate that, Rafe. But here's the issue. The question, who created God, assumes that God is inside time, inside space, inside causality, just like everything in the universe. But classical theism says God is not a thing in the universe. God is not an object with a beginning. God is the reason anything exists at all. Everything inside the universe needs a cause, but the universe itself, reality itself, requires an explanation that is not bound by time or space. All right, but Dawkins makes a powerful point. If you want to explain something incredibly complex, like the universe, by proposing something even more complex, like God, then you've solved nothing. Quote from Dawkins, "A designer God cannot be used to explain complexity because the designer himself would require an explanation. A God capable of designing galaxies, DNA, consciousness, would be far more complex than the universe itself. So invoking God is like trying to explain a riddle with an even bigger riddle." Ion, that's a common critique, but it misunderstands how classical philosophy defines God. God isn't complex. God isn't made of parts. God isn't a machine-like entity with internal components. God is defined as eternal, uncaused, immaterial, outside time. The simplest possible explanation for why anything exists. Something timeless doesn't begin. Something immaterial doesn't emerge. So the question, who created God, becomes like asking, what's north of the North Pole? The question misunderstands the concept. Let's consider something modern. The Big Bang. Before the Big Bang, we have no evidence of time or space. But that doesn't mean it was God. Quantum cosmology shows that universes can emerge from fluctuations in a quantum vacuum. No designer necessary, just physics. I love physics, but let's be precise. A quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's a sea of energy governed by laws. So the real question becomes, where did the laws come from? Where did the quantum field come from? Why does anything exist instead of nothing? Even if you propose infinite universes, infinite fluctuations, all of that still requires existence. And existence cannot come from non-existence. But you're assuming that infinite regress is impossible. Maybe reality has always existed. Maybe it didn't need a beginning. Maybe the chain of cause and effect is eternal. Fair point. But here's the issue. An infinite chain of brute facts explains nothing. If every link in a chain is dependent, the chain as a whole is still dependent. Imagine a chain of paper clips hanging in the air. Every clip is held up by another clip, but the entire chain still falls unless something non-paperclip holds it. An infinite regress is still a chain of things that require a cause. You never reach a foundation. But invoking God is still adding an unnecessary layer. We can explain complexity through evolution. We can explain order through natural laws. We can explain planets, stars, galaxies through physics. Where is the need for a creator? Because the laws themselves are unexplained. Because existence itself is unexplained. Because consciousness, the fact that the universe became aware of itself, is unexplained. Because abstract objects like mathematics are eternal truths that exist independently of matter. Every scientific explanation presupposes the existence of a rational, ordered, law-bound universe. Why is the universe logical? Why does it follow mathematics? Why does it allow life? God isn't an extra layer. God is the foundation that makes physics possible. Dawkins uses the ultimate Boeing 747 analogy. He says that the idea of a God designing the universe is like saying a tornado randomly built a perfect Boeing 747. It's far more improbable. You're multiplying improbabilities. And that analogy fails because it imagines God as a machine, a complex object built from parts. But God, philosophically, is not composed of parts. He is pure existence, necessary being, the ground of reality. A Boeing 747 is complex, but the number 7 is not complex, yet it's foundational. God is more like a necessary truth than a machine.
Rafe. You know, Ion, when we zoom out of the theological framing and step into metaphilosophy, the philosophy of philosophy, the entire debate becomes something else entirely. The question of God isn't merely metaphysical. It's epistemic. It's methodological. It's structural. It's ultimately a question about how human beings form explanations and what counts as a satisfying explanation. Richard Dawkins approaches the world as a scientist. His instinct is reductionist. Break reality into parts, explain the parts using simpler parts, avoid unnecessary metaphysical commitments. But classical theism isn't playing the same game. It isn't about reducing complexity. It's about grounding existence. It's about ontology, being itself. So the debate isn't, does God exist? The debate is, what is the correct explanatory framework for reality? And that's where I think Dawkins, brilliant as he is, never steps into. Ion. Exactly. This debate is not ultimately scientific, but meta-rational. It's about the limits and scope of explanation. Science explains within the universe. Philosophy explains the universe itself. Science explains states and transitions. Philosophy explains the ground of possibility. Science asks, how does this occur? Philosophy asks, why does anything occur at all? At this level, the God question isn't even religious. It's structural. Once you study metaphysics, you realize the universe has 3 major puzzles. Existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? Order. Why is reality structured mathematically and logically? Consciousness. How does subjective experience arise? Any worldview must solve these 3, or explain why they don't need solving. Rafe. And here's where I find myself torn. Dawkins treats the God hypothesis as a bad scientific explanation, but many philosophical models treat God as a necessary ontological condition, and those 2 claims aren't even in the same category. Comparing God to Zeus is like comparing quantum mechanics to astrology. They're not the same kind of theory. But here's my concern. If we say God is outside space, time, causation, and explanation, then God risks becoming an epistemic black box, a kind of metaphysical wildcard that stops inquiry
rather than deepens it. Ion. And that's where classical theism differs from simplistic theism. Classical theism doesn't say God stops inquiry. It says inquiry must terminate at some fundamental layer, and that layer must be necessary, not contingent. This is not a theological convenience. It's a logical inevitability. Even in physics, every theory reduces to axioms that are non-derivable. Every mathematical system is built on primitive truths. Every model assumes unprovable postulates. So the question isn't, do we have an uncaused foundation? The question is, which uncaused foundation is most coherent? A timeless mind? A timeless physical law? A brute fact? Or something else entirely? Rafe. And I have to admit, at this meta level, the idea of a brute fact feels like giving up. It's like saying, reality just is, don't ask why. But the moment you accept that, all rational inquiry collapses. If something can exist without explanation, then everything could. Causality, reason, science, all become optional. Ion. Exactly. Dawkins critiques the God hypothesis for not having an explanation, but his alternative also ends at an unexplained foundation, whether that's physical laws, quantum fields, or the multiverse. The difference is this. Theism claims the foundation is inherently self-explanatory. Atheism claims the foundation needs no explanation. Theism says the ground of being is necessary, eternal, simple, non-physical, unconditioned, logically self-contained. Atheism says the ground of being is either brute, arbitrary, unexplained, or emergent from something else, which leads to regress.
Rafe. You know, Ion, after listening to your perspective, I'll concede something important here. Richard Dawkins has made a tremendous impact in pushing people toward skeptical inquiry. But I also think his critiques often target a version of God that most philosophers abandoned centuries ago. The anthropomorphic deity, the old man in the sky, the tribal god of myths, the interventionist magician. That's not the God you're talking about. You're referring to a metaphysical foundation of reality, a necessary being that grounds mathematics, logic, causation, existence itself. And I'll admit, Dawkins doesn't thoroughly engage with that concept. He critiques religion at the human level, institutions, scriptures, traditions, not the philosophical core. But here's my position. Even if classical theism provides a coherent concept of God, coherence alone doesn't guarantee existence. Mathematics is coherent, but numbers don't exist as physical objects. Logic is coherent, but you can't bump into a logical law. So the question becomes, are we justified in making the leap from a metaphysical abstraction, a necessary being, to the active, intentional creator that religions describe? And that's where I remain unconvinced. Ion. That's a fair challenge, Rafe. One of the most sophisticated and honest critiques I've heard. But let me respond carefully. You're right. Coherence doesn't prove existence. But coherence limits the possible explanations. When we examine reality, we're forced into a set of options, like forks in a cosmic road. The universe is self-caused, which violates logic, because nothing can cause itself before it exists. The universe is uncaused, which contradicts scientific reasoning, because everything that begins to exist requires a cause. There is an infinite regress of explanations, which solves nothing.
because infinite dependence never becomes independence. The universe came from nothing, which is literally the belief that non-being can produce being, a contradiction. There is a necessary being, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, that grounds all contingent existence. All 5 possibilities are not equally reasonable. Only one avoids contradiction, avoids brute facts, avoids infinite regress, and matches what logic demands. A necessary, uncaused, eternal foundation. Call it the ground of being. Call it the prime mover. Call it the unconditioned reality. Call it God. Now, this doesn't automatically prove scriptures, rituals, religions, but it does establish something deeply important. Reality requires a foundation that is not itself contingent, and that foundation, by definition, is what philosophers have always meant by God. Ion. Great. Another important point. Let's unpack it. If the foundation were a physical law, it would still need a deeper explanation. Why does that law exist? Why does it have that form? Why does it govern reality? Why does it operate with mathematical precision? And here's the crucial part. Laws don't cause themselves. Laws don't select themselves. Laws don't write themselves. Laws don't choose constants. But intelligence does. Whenever we see fine-tuning, information, order, rational structure, we explain it through mind, not matter. The universe doesn't just exist, it makes sense. It follows logic. It uses mathematics. It is structured as though written in code. And code comes from intelligence. Meaning comes from intelligence. Purpose comes from intelligence. Reason comes from intelligence. If the foundation of reality were purely physical, it would be blind, mechanistic, purposeless. Yet reality displays purpose-like behavior, rational consistency, mathematical order, and laws that allow consciousness to emerge. The universe behaves as though it was designed to be understood. And that intelligibility, that rationality, points not to a brute fact, but to a mind.
Rafe, I'll admit, that's compelling. And I also admit that many atheists overlook how strange it is that the universe is comprehensible. But I'm not ready to say a mind is the only explanation. Maybe one day physics will provide an answer that doesn't require intentionality. Ion. And maybe. But here's the key difference between our positions. You're waiting for evidence to appear. I'm following the evidence we currently have. And right now, all available evidence points toward fine-tuning, intelligibility, the necessity of a first cause, the impossibility of infinite regress, the dependence of physical laws on deeper explanations, the emergence of consciousness from non-conscious matter. If someone wants to say physics will solve it someday, that's not science. That's faith. I'm simply suggesting the most reasonable, least arbitrary explanation. A necessary, uncaused, timeless, immaterial, conscious source of existence. Rafe, softening. But I'll tell you what, your version of God is far more intellectually respectable than the one Dawkins critiques. Maybe the debate isn't between atheism versus religion, but between two interpretations of ultimate reality. Mind first or matter first? Ion. And that's exactly where the conversation should be. Not about dogma, not about institutions, but about the ultimate nature of reality. And that's why the question, who created God, is the wrong question. It misunderstands God as a thing,
rather than the reason things exist. What an incredible discussion. Whether you agree with Ion or Rafe, the question remains profound, challenging, and endlessly fascinating. If you enjoyed this debate, make sure to follow and share this episode. And remember, questioning is the highest form of intelligence. And so, one of the oldest questions humanity has ever wrestled with, we arrive at a place that isn't quite an answer, and isn't quite a conclusion. But maybe that's the point. The question, who created God, isn't just a theological puzzle or an atheist critique. It's a mirror, one that reflects our desire for certainty in a universe that often gives us anything but. Some believe the universe is an accident. Others believe it's the work of a divine intelligence. And others think reality may be something stranger than both views. What's undeniable is this: the more science progresses, the deeper the mystery becomes. Every discovery expands the horizon instead of closing it. Dawkins argues that invoking a designer only pushes the problem back a step. Theists argue that complexity points toward intention, not randomness. And here we are, positioned between both worlds, trying to piece together truth using logic, experience, intuition, and evidence. Maybe the real value of this debate isn't the answer itself, but the journey it forces us on. How do we deal with uncertainty? How much mystery can we tolerate? How far are we willing to go in pursuit of understanding, even when the answers challenge what we already believe? Whether you think the universe came from a divine mind, a quantum event, or something we don't yet have words for, the fact that you're engaging with these ideas puts you in a long tradition of humans who refuse to accept easy explanations. And before we close, we want to make something clear. This entire discussion is meant purely for educational, philosophical, and intellectual exploration, never to offend, dismiss, or attack anyone's beliefs. The goal here is curiosity, not conflict. So keep thinking, keep questioning, keep stretching the limits of what you believe is possible. Because whether God created the universe, or the universe created itself, or reality is something far stranger, the search for truth is what makes us human. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you found yourself thinking, disagreeing, reflecting, or even arguing with us in your mind, then this conversation has done its job. Until next time, stay curious, stay rational, and stay open to the vast mystery of existence.